Welcome to Life Sci AI, the podcast series, brought to you by SciPro and hosted by me, Nick Mahoney. This series looks to shine a light on the key developments of AI within the life science industry. Following on from the successful roundtable SciPro hosted in 2020, we aim to bring cross-collaboration between common projects and to help promote the use of AI in life sciences. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Here we go again for episode 2 of Life Sci AI, the podcast series brought to you by SciPro. If you missed episode 1 with Olivier Joly from Brainomics, then please go back and listen to that on your preferred podcast streaming service. But for now, we continue looking at the development of AI within life sciences. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Marc Goldfinger, a product specialist at Perspectum Diagnostics. So if you may, Marc, please give everyone a short introduction and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you on this podcast. Just as a point of order, it's now Perspectum. It's no longer Perspectum Diagnostics. We've legally had the name change. So. But no, so like Nick said, I'm a product specialist. So I started in Perspectum as a biomedical scientist, and I found that the science was fascinating, but it wasn't integrating to the product as well as I thought it could be. And when we're integrating artificial intelligence and clinical information, I think having a good scientific background is essential. And so I transitioned more towards a product development background. And my role is basically taking new concepts and bringing them from concept to reality and babysitting them along the way to make sure that they fit a specific brief, they pass FDA muster, they meet the user requirements, and that they then get sold. And that's what I do at Perspectum.
Awesome. So, I mean, we'll go into sort of the products and such at Perspectum in a little while, but in the last episode, Olivier began with where he started as a scientist and researcher, and actually you have very similar foundations and interests because he was looking at neuroscience and the senses, and you started out looking at neuroscience as well. And we perhaps didn't go in as much detail as I would have liked with Olivier in that. But for you, why was that such a keen interest at the start?
So that's a good question. So just as for those who don't know me, my background in neuroscience and neuropathology in particular has been there since my undergraduate. So I've always thought that the brain is kind of like the final frontier of unknown knowledge. There's so much unknown that even doing something basic is staking your claim to science and really pushing the boundaries of knowledge. I worked on a variety of neurodegenerative disorders, and I worked with Alzheimer's and trauma-induced disorders. My doctorate was in a disorder called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or trauma-induced dementia. I worked on rare neurodegenerative diseases called Batten disease. So I've done the gamut. And I think where this really comes from is again, that sense of we know so little about all of it. My doctorate was exploring vascular disruption within trauma within a specific disease, and it's never been looked at before. And something so basic has never been analyzed into the way that I wanted to do it. But I think what we know about the brain, it being so limited, it's also growing so quickly. And I think from when I did my undergraduate to when I did my PhD, the information changed completely. What we knew as basis of this is the brain and this is how it works, obviously it's all the same, but we knew so much more about the brain, and we knew so much more about its properties and its emergent properties, that it just seemed like it's one of the most fascinating parts of science and medicine that you can be a part of right now. And I mean, I could talk for hours, don't even get me started. But the one thing that I found was really going back to it was I was introduced to a lot of the patients who suffered from these debilitating disorders. So when I worked in trauma, I met people who had suffered severe accidents, or people who had suffered repeated head injuries due to science, due to sports injuries. And it kind of puts your work into context. And when the brain is affected, I think it utterly changes the human being. And the notion of the individual who was there pre-injury and post-injury is completely different. And you don't really get that with that many types of, organ-specific injuries. If you have liver injury, you're not going to change as a human being. But, if you have, like a continuous football injury and your frontal cortex is all filled with proteins called tau, then there's this weird shift, this strange shift towards becoming almost a different human being. And you always become motivated by that person to understand why it's happening and how to help them in the end.
So was it driven by your experience of learning the difference between the person before the injury and after injury? Is that a key driver for you, or were you always very purpose-led?
I think it was more purpose. I think it was more purpose-led, and it is almost that horrid cliche if you just want to help people, and I know most people roll their eyes when they hear that, and I probably do as well. But I think there's something inherently motivating about this kind of purpose that drives you, and each of us, finds their own purpose, and there's never one is more valid than the other. But for me, it's almost seeing that application of your knowledge and of your science towards almost integrating into healthcare, or integrating into drug, or integrating into patient care, and ameliorating that disease or that disorder can really, it's so satisfying, and it's so wonderful, and it's probably incredibly selfish, but to have that approach. But it's great to have that approach where you actually help someone, and it feels selfish. But no, it's always been more purpose-led, and and the science has always been the driver, because it's the fascinating part as well.
So going into neuroscience, was your PhD was it related to AI? Were you using AI approaches, or was it post your PhD that you really took up AI?
So my PhD was in the field of pathology, which is about as kind of archaic as you get. Pathology is incredibly important, and it's an art unto itself. And again, talk about for hours, but there's very little AI, except what we're doing now, which I'll talk about in a bit, how you're advancing it. But really, I was introduced to AI on large scales. I mean, obviously, I worked with it in uni, and in my master's, we were looking at protein folding. But one of the aspects was when I was working in the cabinet office, it was integrating artificial intelligence and new ways of using AI to support government, just to support the government industry, and trying to understand how we can streamline and facilitate these processes. And I think going back to things like my master's and my undergraduate, where we were using AI to predict protein folding, or to identify patient demographics based on large-scale epidemiological studies in China, you kind of get smatterings that you can pull together that creates, almost little breadcrumbs of information that really builds up to something that you can take from, healthcare, epidemiology, proteins, and then it builds into, creating artificial intelligence algorithms for biopsies. And that's kind of where it started to build. But I think my proper introduction to AI as you are now working with artificial intelligence, and not just in this kind of, yes, let's integrate it. You are building artificial intelligence, and you are creating artificial intelligence, was properly introduced in Perspectum.
I see. And for you, working within like integration and trying to put it into different areas of government policy, you probably had was it like almost an outsider's perspective of AI almost? And if it was so, did it live up to everything you thought it was, or was it quite different when you became almost embedded and on the tools at Perspectum?
It's so funny. I think people have these buzzwords that mean so much, and literally nothing. So we have this, and the biggest joke for me in terms of like a really important concept that is a buzzword beyond buzzwords is blockchain, right? So you take up the term blockchain, people say, oh my God, blockchain, I love blockchain. What is it? And so in the government, we were working with, the departments, the Ministry of Defense and the Met Police and the Department of Health and Social Care. And we were trying to kind of integrate these artificial intelligence structures or these, ledger technologies as a way to improve technology within these systems. And you would be speaking to people who would say, oh, yes, we need blockchain, but can you explain to me what it is first? And then I'll tell you if we need it or not. And it's almost, AI has this kind of panacea type of approach. It solves everything. And we know now, and as I've worked with over the past few years, we know that that's not the case. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. And I think it's now trying to figure out where to use it best and most effectively. And I think working within Perspectum, what's quite exciting is, we've spent multiple years honing our skills within this whole kind of AI field to say, does it work here? Does it work here? Does it work here? How can we improve this? No, you need a human. No, you need a specialist. No, you need an expert to supplant this. No, this can only be a diagnostic support tool. And as we move on, obviously it'll become more advanced and better as a tool itself. But I think we need to move away, and I can talk about this later, but we need to move away from AI being this cure-all, and mostly as a way to really understand its use within healthcare beyond just the panacea that we think it is.
Absolutely, I think you're right. If you were to use AI in absolutely everything and try and do that, it devalues it. Because people think, oh, this is over expensive, over complicated, and we don't need it, and therefore it's a whole fad and a phase. Where actually it's not. It's just being misused.
I agree.
So going into Perspectum, you have 3 major products, right?
That is correct. Yes. So we actually have 5 products, but I'm working on 3 of the kind of newer products. My role is within kind of newer indications. So we're working on some that I can't really talk about now, but the ones that we've brought to market, I'm more than happy to discuss. And I think my love that I will fight to the death for is my digital pathology product. And it kind of harkens back to when I was doing my PhD, and you would be hunched over a microscope for days, weeks, years, trying to identify patterns and create scoring systems and evaluate, different kind of proteinopathies or changes within these biopsies. And this was brains, very different from what we're focusing on now, which is liver and GI tract. But it comes down to the same thing, that we need a human being to identify these patterns. And some of these patterns are just very simple at identifying. So, are these little globules of fat? Yep. How many of them are there? What percentage of fat is there? Do we see inflammatory cells? We do. What's the percentage of inflammatory cell coverage? I can tell you. And so I think what we wanted to do was to take away the monotonous and often time-consuming and almost impossible tasks for humans. So how many cells are there? How many inflammatory cells are there? How many fat globules are there? Which a human could do, but it would take them, many hours, and it can, an AI algorithm can do in seconds. So we built these tools to look at the 4 cardinal features of liver injury, which is steatosis or fat, inflammation, fibrosis, and a really horrid amorphous concept called hepatocellular ballooning, which if you ask 2 different pathologists, they'll probably give you 2 different definitions of what the term is. So it's a bit of a head scratcher, especially when you're trying to create an algorithm that doesn't have a very good definition. But so we built these 4 products as a way to kind of bring pathology in the 21st century. And this is kind of on the back of surveying the larger political and regulatory shift. And my time in the government taught me that, if you're a scientist or you're working in a company, the silo of I only need to understand the science or I only need to understand the business case is probably not the best way forward. because there's always going to be external factors affecting the way that good science is done and the way things can be sold or integrated into an ever-emerging or changing dynamic of population. We know that glass slides, which are what you normally use to look at liver biopsies, actually physical glass slides you put under a microscope, they're very difficult to work with, cumbersome, you can't ship them as easily. And so we were working with digitizing these slides or scanning them, which is a big thing for the FDA and the kind of European medical authorities. And so this is the big push now, to go from glass slides to digitizing them. So we thought, okay, if we're going to digitize them, what else can we do? What ways can we create different biomarkers or ways of assessing disease using biological tools to assess severity or diagnose things? So this is kind of what I've been working on, and we brought it from concept, and we worked with KOLs or key opinion leaders and different types of pathologists and different centers, and we built our algorithms and we created libraries and we were doing clinical trials, and we've actually just made our first few sales, which has been quite exciting. Through use of our digital pathology platform, and it's been a great time.
Awesome, thank you for taking us through that. So if I've understood that correctly, you've almost gone from, I don't want to try and simplify it too much, but you've gone from what would have been typewriter to computer, but in a digital pathology idea.
Exactly. I mean, I don't want to say I'm a genius, but no, I mean, and it's tough because a lot of people they're quite scared to use new technology, and I think right now we're at the cusp, and there's a few other companies that are doing something similar. And I think what makes us unique is that we have the opportunity to offer a million other things that bolster, and we can build beyond just the biopsy. But I think we're at the point right now where the transition from typewriter to computer is happening so quickly, and people are still clutching to their typewriter because that's what they know and that's what they're comfortable with, and the regulatory authorities haven't caught up. And this is true across all artificial intelligence and technology, that the speed at which things change is never going to match up to the speed at which we see regulatory authorities approve or even understand these types of changes.
Yeah, the amount of conversations that I have with industry leaders around regulation and standards and potentially implementing one and coming up with one is so regular and happens more and more times now, as conversations I think are going in that direction. But when that happens, there will be a big shift in the market, because some companies might be outside of the standard, might be outside of the regulation, and that almost is a massive economic impact for them at that time. But for the industry, long term, it will enable for more R&D in those areas, because it reduces the risk, because you know what to aim for, because that's going to clear that line, right?
Exactly. And and obviously the regulatory authorities are doing their job, right? You don't want to have things that can potentially harm or kill someone on the market. I mean, that's what they're there for. But there is almost a sense of, and we've worked with a lot of people in the FDA, and they are amazing scientists. And we had a call a few months ago actually with some of the leaders of the metabolics in the FDA. It's quite a late call, especially because we're based in the UK and in America. But it's amazing to talk to them, to say, yes, we understand that this is happening, but we need to move at almost like a glacier-like pace, because we don't want to make mistakes. Because the minute that something comes through and it's on their shoulders to approve these things, and I understand that it can be frustrating, but it's necessary. But I think as things pick up the pace and we generate evidence at sites and speeds that we've never seen before, more evidence will be there to support the claims, and we'll see things change a lot faster. And having real world evidence, which is what we're focusing on at Perspectum, and kind of these internal clinical trials to prove that your devices are actually making a difference, and having that published and peer reviewed and having people champion you, it goes through much faster than you would imagine. But it's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah, definitely. I think the more collaboration that happens as well is better. But I think there's an idea of empathy on both sides. because everyone's going in the same direction.
Yeah.
I just, with your digital pathology products, now you've almost got the foundation of moving across, as we said, from typewriter to computer. Do you have an idea of how far it could go? Would you be adding on further things, different types of disease diagnostics from that, or are you comfortable with having the?
We've started to build. So we have additional artificial intelligence algorithms or AI algorithms and machine learning algorithms for GI tract as well. So working with inflammatory bowel disease and cancer. Actually not cancer as of now, but we work with other companies for cancer. But for inflammatory bowel disease, we've developed these kind of pathological AI tools, and it's exciting because similar principles, different diseases, and you tweak it. And it's always that initial kind of sit down that you have where you're at a blank canvas and you go, okay, what is the pathologist trying to get? What is the clinician trying to get? And what do we know in terms of outcomes and kind of clinical events and everything? How can we integrate that? So what we are detailing are clinically relevant data points. So we just don't want to say, oh yes, you have X number of things in your liver, because if it doesn't make any sense and it has no clinical application, or it means absolutely nothing to the clinicians or pathologists, then it's pointless. So I think it's so exciting at that start. And without going into too much detail, because I don't think I'm probably allowed to, but we are definitely building on top of our liver offering as well as our GI offering. So it's going quite nicely, actually. It's really cool. And this is where, wonderful, if people want to join Perspectum and they're keen and passionate about pathology, all the more power to them.
Yeah, for sure. And you've not just got the digital pathology products as well. So what about the visualization piece? That's quite intriguing from my perspective.
Oh, right. Yeah. So there's two other tools that I can talk about today. The one you're referring to is called MRCP Plus, which I'll describe in a second. And then we also have our multi-organ phenotyping platform, which is a bit of a mouthful, which would be, it's called Atlas, which I'll explain in a minute. So I'll start with MRCP Plus. And MRCP Plus is, again, one of my technology babies that I've been with over the past 2 years. And what this actually does is use a combination of artificial intelligence and human expertise to turn regular MRCPs, which stands for magnetic resonance cholangiopancreatography. Again, you don't expect to remember that about MRCP, but we turn them into 3D quantitative models. And so we use specific algorithms that identify tubular structures, and we can automatically identify diameters and change or the dynamism between the diameters, and what this means for diseases within the biliary tree, so that's within the liver. And there are specific rare diseases like primary sclerosing cholangitis or inflammatory bowel disease or even pancreatitis, where these tubes become distorted. So they either shrink down and they have something called strictures, where the diameter becomes smaller, or they blow up and the diameters become larger, and they're called dilatations. So this causes a whole host of different injuries in the liver, cholestasis or chronic liver disease, cancer. And so what we've built basically is a tool that can automatically quantify these diameters, identify changes between different scans, and look at what we've produced, which are different biomarkers or metrics that understand the change within the biliary tree. And so over the past 2 years, I've helped develop that with the team here at Perspectum, and we've been creating clinical trials internally, and we've sold this to external clinical trials to show how these metrics, so one of them, I'm just going to tell you a random one, I don't expect it to mean anything to you, but if you take all the different structures and dilatations and you count all of them together, that's a value, and that value turns out to predict if a person is going to need a transplant or not. And so what we can then do is create something called biomarkers, like I was explaining before. So things that can predict the onset of disease or predict the onset of treatment or necessity of treatment. And we can use that through our clinical investigations or our clinical studies. And we basically create these biomarkers so that clinicians and radiologists and patients can get a scan. It can then be analyzed by Perspectum. We get these values. These values are given to a clinician, and it says this person is more or less likely to develop harsher disease, or they're more or less likely to have this rare disease, or they're more or less likely to need transplant, or more or less likely to suffer or cause mortality. And so it's kind of informing the patients. And while we are working within a clinical setting, it can also be helpful for things like biopharma. So if they want to see how their drugs are, how efficacious their drugs are, they'll need different ways to assess if it's doing anything to the liver or to the biliary tree. So if they give someone a drug, how do they know that those strictures or dilatations are improving? We can tell you. And it's about using that combination of artificial intelligence, which can automatically detect these changes, plus radiographers and radiologists who can expertly craft and say, that's not this or that's this, create these products, and then we sell it off to the clinicians and to the biopharma.
Awesome. So it's very much a partnership then between the AI, the product, and then the clinicians and radiologists to support the patient together. It's like a family of support, rather than just having it just on AI or just on the clinicians. You team them all together on this product.
Yeah, I mean, in normal clinical practice, there's something called an MDT, or multidisciplinary team, where you have opinions from different specialists that all come in, and these opinions form a general medical opinion. And you have a lead physician who will, you'll take the pathologist, the radiologist, the hepatologist, and then go, okay, this is what we see. And I think using AI and experts to kind of craft these really, I mean, they're beautiful. If you go on Perspectum.com, you can see some of it. They're really gorgeous. They're different colors and they spin. But apart from that, apart from creating really beautiful imagery, it's the quantitative metrics are actually quite informative, quite nice. And it's having these quantitative metrics that form, that will form and are beginning to form kind of part of the arsenal of the hepatologist and the rare researcher and the clinician and the patient, so that they can be better informed and make better informed opinions. And when we have drugs available for certain rare diseases, for example, like primary sclerosing cholangitis, which no drugs exist, we can use these as measures of drug efficacy. This is actually helping you or not helping you.
Awesome. So it's not just for diagnostics, it's for research into therapeutics as well.
Monitoring, therapeutics, intervention. Yeah.
And just before we go into sort of where you see AI, and we touched on it briefly before about the idea of it not becoming a panacea, right? Just quickly, briefly, just so we're covering all bases on the Atlas tool as to what that is for everyone as well.
Yeah, so the Atlas tool is arguably probably the most exciting tool that we have, because if you're a radiologist or a radiographer, it really is like a kid in a candy shop. We are using a one-stop scan, which can scan a patient, and it can get you over 100 metrics, so 100 different readouts on your lungs, your kidney, your liver, your spleen, your pancreas, your heart, your aorta. And all one person has to do is go into a scanner. It can be any scanner, 1.5 Tesla or 3 Tesla. It can be any scanner maker, so it's agnostic. So we're not developing this with a specific company. Right. And they get this scan, and you can look at any type of organ in the abdominal, and we can tell you what's happening. Now, the reason why this is important, and I think this is probably something that's near and dear to my heart, is that we're moving away from the single organ concept of disease now, right? It's no longer, if you are ill, then only one organ is affected. We know that multiple aspects of your body are unwell, and this is the concept of multimorbidity. And this is especially true for diseases or disorders like diabetes, mellitus 2, or diabetes 1. But especially, and we're using this now within emerging diseases and viruses like COVID. And we have a study called CoverScan going on at Perspectum right now. And you can actually look on coverscan.com if you're interested to find out more. We're still recruiting. But we are looking at these organs in patients who have convalesced from the COVID-19 infection. And we're trying to understand exactly how the multiple organs in these patients, what happens to them after infection, and what it means in terms of ongoing or potentially long-term effects post-infection. We don't know. We know nothing, right? I mean, COVID happened in March.
Yeah.
And what we've figured from our research in the past, since we've started the study, is we've seen from the hundreds of patients that we've already analyzed that, of course, that there is pulmonary disorder, so there's lung issues, but a third of our patients also have cardiac issues. We see a high proportion of patients with liver and kidney injury. And so it paints a much more rich and kind of alarming picture that we have people who weren't even hospitalized and they have cardiac events, and they have reduced something called left ventricular ejection fraction. So there's less oxygenated blood going into their body. You have people who weren't hospitalized and yet their kidneys are inflamed. And what this allows us to do, and goes well beyond the idea of science for science, but really inform healthcare officials and policymakers that this is what we're seeing, and it might change in the future. And again, this is only in the short term, so we can't really see the long term as well going. This is what we're seeing, and we can now prep for this. So I don't even know what the number is now, but there's millions of people across the world who've been infected with COVID-19, and if we just assume only their lungs were damaged, then we're going to miss potential people who are unwell because their heart or their liver or the kidney or the spleen are also affected. And by building these kind of multimodal tools, and it's something as simple as you just sit in one scan in, it's like that, then you can revolutionize the way that we have a multimodal or multi-organ assessment of disease.
And looking to the future, is that where you see medical device that utilize AI need to go to have as much of an impact? Otherwise, we might be having, if you said earlier, AI being used in the wrong concepts. Do you really think that's where we should go?
So I'm probably going to be controversial by saying yes. Well, I don't know if it's controversial. I mean, some people will be like, no, reductionist. So science has this almost reductionist type approach that in order to kind of truly understand something, you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And in neuroscience, it's the like holds true, the very essence of neuroscience. And we understand that the deeper you go and the more intricate you understand the problem, then you better understand the disease as a whole. But we also understand now that organs interact with each other. Your body is not just a silo of one thing. And by integrating data across different access points, I think this is where AI in medicine needs to go. I think we need to stop thinking from a purely siloed position and start understanding the relationship between organs, between genomics, between blood-based biomarkers, MR, invasive, non-invasive techniques. This is where we have to start going. And it's obviously easier said than done because the data is obviously disparate data points. And how do you actually integrate things that are saying, completely speaking different languages almost? This is the challenge, for people working in AI now, that is taking this information and making so that they actually are speaking the same language and that they do so intelligibly and actually offer insight. Because if I, as a doctor will look at a patient and basically do this integration to understand a disease or disorder, to make a diagnosis, and they'll look at the bloods, they'll look at the scans, they'll look at the opinions from different from different doctors, and they'll integrate this information into a cohesive diagnosis. But we can do that with hundreds of thousands of data points. We can stratify patients. We can bring together millions of different information that a human can't handle. And we can create better diagnostics, better monitoring tools. But it's still in its infancy. And this is where we need to go. And it all comes down to, taking this information and working cross-partisan, cross-party lines almost. And when I was in uni, I remember there was this big push that, to work with different colleagues across universities or to work with people in different areas of medicine. And it's this, it's this relationship that you form outside of your area of expertise that really pushes the boundaries and really makes you think about things a bit differently. So I think this is where we have to go. And I think for medicine, multi-morbidity is going to be the word of the day. And it makes things more complicated. It makes things harder to deal with. I mean, it's already going to affect, definitely going to affect our, the cash-strapped NHS, which, is amazing and necessary. But how do you then tell someone you need to take hundreds of thousands of data points, and it's not going to necessarily be cheap, already in a company, in a position where they're struggling. I think this is where we need to go, but we also need to understand its implications politically and what we can do at large, right? So if we can take hundreds of thousands of data points, that's wonderful. But what is its practical use? Can the NHS use it? Can the American health system integrate this? Can different payers allow this as part of a diagnostic tool? I mean, these are all the different questions that different companies will ask and shape. And I think as we grow, Perspectum or any other kind of AI company, and as we mature, we'll understand that working as a lone wolf won't get you as far as working alongside other companies.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect ending for a lot of people to think about. And a lot of questions could come from that, and a lot of people will have a thing to think about, I'm sure, listening to that. Definitely the final piece there from yourself, Mark, and just want to say thank you for sharing your insight and your knowledge. It's been really intriguing. So that comes to the end of the second episode of Life Sci AI, the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and you'll be able to pick up the next episode of the podcast on your favorite streaming service in a couple of weeks' time. And if you want to listen back to Olivier Joly from Brainomics' first episode, you can also get that there. But thank you very much for your time, Mark. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Cheers. Thanks so much.
That finishes this episode for Life Sci AI, the podcast series. I hope you got as much enjoyment out of that as I did. Join myself again in a couple of weeks, where I'll be shining yet another light on a new area of AI within life sciences. In the meantime, follow SciPro on social media to hear about the latest updates on the series, but also on the roundtables and other work we do day to day. Please also like, share, tell a friend, and comment on this podcast so that we can all promote the use of AI in life sciences together. Thanks for listening.